You guys beat me to the punch. You may be seated. Well, Jeff is gone today and left me in charge, so everybody enjoy your Sunday, and we'll see you next week. That's how it works, right, Greg? That's right. But no, today we're going to look at Psalm 139. Psalm 139, most of us know it. It's for a lot of us, it's a psalm that is close to our hearts. It says, "O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high, I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, the night is bright as day, for darkness is as light with you. For you formed me in my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance, and your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast are the sum of them. If I were to count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, and I am still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malice intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred, and I count them my enemies. So search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there is any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." It's the word of the Lord. Now, I should pretense this message with, in my mind, when I felt I was called to ministry, I told myself one thing, and Jeff can attest to this when you see him next. I actually told him that there's one book I don't preach from, and that's Psalms. It's the whole rest of the Old Testament. There's the New Testament. I don't touch Psalms. And it's not because I don't like Psalms. It's actually my favorite book in the entire Bible. I think it is one of the most beautiful books that God has given us. But in reality, what Psalms is it's poetry. So what makes it hard to preach about is when it comes to poetry, when we read poetry, I can read a poet, and you can read, and we can come away with different meanings for it. And a lot of times the Psalms are the same way, because in a way it's like God has wrote us a poetry book. And when we read the same psalm, God is speaking about his love to us in different ways. And so I want to pretense this message because I know out of all the Psalms that God would lead me to, it'd be Psalms 139, the Psalms that almost everyone has something of meaning from it. But I want to pretense the message with, if you've heard a message before from Psalms 139, or if you've gone through a study through Psalms 139, or if you've personally done devotions through Psalm 139 and you've taken away different meanings, know that I'm not saying that that's not the true meaning, and I'm not saying that what you've taken from it is any less valuable or wrong at all. I guess the best way to say this is that the message I want to share today is what God has spoke to me about Psalms 139. And I hope if anything, Psalms 139 would just have a deeper meaning for you today. Psalms 139 would have even more that God can speak to you about than what he's already spoken to you about before. And I'm also going to do something out of character because I've never done a sermon this way, but I'm going to come right out and tell you what I'm hoping I can clearly relate to you. And that is when I was going through Psalms 139 as God dragged me to it and I was kicking and screaming. I actually read this psalm in a completely different way than I had read it before. I didn't just see it as David proclaiming glory to God, but what I noticed this time around is that it spoke clearly about the relationship between David and God. And when I started to see, what God started to reveal to me was knowledge about his presence and the importance of knowing his presence in our lives. And school and commentary books, they'll normally break Psalms 139 into 4 parts. And it's pretty clear to see because David switches tones after verse 6 and verse 13 and in verse 18. There's 4 parts he kind of moves, or stanzas, if we stay on the poetry theme. But what I realized was each one of these parts had a specific identification of God's presence and an insight of what his presence is in our lives. And I realized that verse 1 through 6 talk about God's protective discernment. And then I realized that verses 7 through 12 had spoke about God's persistent grace. And as I continue reading, I found the third part, verses 13 through 18, talked about his incomprehensible passion. And finally, in the last part, I realized that it really spoke about his steadfast presence in our lives. So I hope that I can clearly relay that, those illustrations that God brought to me about this in his presence. So as we began the first part, O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down even before a word is on my tongue. Behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. I'm sure we've all had moments when we were kids where someone came up to us and said, you better be good because God is watching. And I will take the heat for this, but as we're kids or even someone who is new to knowing God, a lot of times that can have an immature outlook to this. Actually, I remember as a kid, the first time I heard that, my first thought was, God watches me go to the bathroom. And almost being like, why is God always watching me? But in reality, we can have those immature thoughts sometimes. And actually, one of the common and immature thoughts that we have is as God is that school teacher walking around with the ruler, and as soon as we mess up, right on our wrist. And, we kind of get that, like, I don't know if, I never had that. I was lucky enough they had laws against that, but I'm sure there's some in here that are going like this right now. But we have that thought sometimes that's who God is. That's his protective over us. In reality, that's not it at all. I mean, there is discipline involved. Paul told us that we are God's children, and does not a father discipline his children that he loves? There's discipline in our lives. But that's not the purpose. It's not meant to just correct us and slap us with a ruler any chance we get because you messed up. It's meant to be in a way to protect us, to be looking out for us. You know when I sit down and when I rise up, you discern my thoughts from afar. It's like that mother who has that sixth sense, who can tell when their child is about to do something that isn't smart. It's like that father who can tell instantly when one of their children is going to be in trouble. And I feel like I could tell stories, I could illustrate it in a lot of different ways, but while I was writing this sermon and I kind of stepped away to look at illustrations, I noticed that my wife had sent me a message on Facebook saying, "Hey, check this out." And I went, "All right, thank you, God." Because like many times, God uses my wife to speak a lot of truth into me. And so I actually want to share this video because I feel like when we talk about God's protective discernment, this is the best way to illustrate it. God's protective discernment. And I think a lot of times we can think of God that he's the one that catches us before we crash into a car or catches us when we fly off a swing. But I think sometimes we forget that he's also the God that will crawl into the crib with us when all we need is someone to hold, or he'll be laying down on the ground with us as we're learning something for the first time, even as simple as getting our motions set, trying to crawl or walk for the first time. And as I continued into the next part, I realized, as I said before, persistent grace. Where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the heaven, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as day, and the darkness is light with you. See, persistent grace is, if you take the two words and you break them apart, it's continually firmly in a course of action. And in spite of difficulty or opposition, and grace is free, unmerited favor. So if we put both those words together and create one definition of persistent grace, is that God's persistent grace, his presence in our life is free. It is unmerited favor that firmly stays the course in our life despite the difficulty we might give, or despite our opposition in life. God is simply there, whether we have earned it or not. Where shall I go from your spirit? I think David knew when he was writing this, almost just more as a confirmation for him. Maybe he needed that reminder, but I think most of us know the answer to that question is nowhere. There's nowhere we can go from God's Spirit. There's a story that I don't share very often, but it's when I think of God, persistence, grace, it's the memory that I always go back to. It's actually the first memory that I can remember. It sounds weird, but I was about 1 year old, and I shouldn't have this memory, but I have actually asked my dad about it and see the surprised look on his face of, yeah, that happened. I can't believe you remember it. And before I start the story, I should say two things. Unless you know some of my backstory, you've all met my mom and my dad. They couldn't be here today. It's my little sister's birthday today, but you've met them. But unless you know some of my backstory, what you wouldn't know is that my mom, who you've all met, is actually my stepmom. She's been my mom since I was 2 years old. She's been through every scraped knee and every up and down that I've had in my life. And most people are surprised when they hear, oh, she's your stepmom. And frankly, I'm glad when I hear that, because that's the way it should be. She to me is my mom in my life. And the other part of this too is that my biological mother, you should know that it's a reconciled relationship. I have that redeemed relationship with her, and forgiveness, and I'm glad that I've actually am fortunate enough to be able to have that. But because of her lifestyle choices, she made some poor decisions. And my mother and my father were actually, my biological mother and my father, they were actually never married. And they had me, and the relationship, obviously, it went south if he's found the love of his life. But through that, my first memory, what I remember is being locked in my room in a crib. And I remember actually being hungry and being scared and actually covered in my own feces. And I just remember being just confused and feeling this feeling of hopeless. And those feelings and this memory, I know that's not the reason why I have this memory, but it's the next part. Because actually what would happen is that my biological mother didn't like my dad seeing me yet. He was the type of dad who had persistent grace. He was persistent in every attribute and refused not to see me. And my older brothers would actually let him in so he could take care of me when my mother left. And I remember being almost like at this pinnacle a moment of feeling hopeless and really mainly confusion as being 1 year old. But I remember the door being opened and all of a sudden having this hope and this feeling of rescue because I saw my dad. And I don't remember what really happens next. That's where it ends. It ends with this moment of my dad's here. And that's what I think about when I think of God's persistent grace, because I've had other moments in my life, and I'm sure we've all have had those moments where we have those moments of just almost feeling confused or embarrassed or scared or frankly just completely hopeless. And then in walks God. Our dad is here. Even to the point where Jesus would walk the hills of Calvary and hang on a cross. Free and unmerited favor continually, firmly in our life, despite the difficulty, despite the opposition. It's God's persistent grace in our life. And as I continued reading, and God revealed to me that not only is His presence a protective discernment, not only is His presence a persistent grace, but then I read the next part and had that incomprehensible passion just spelled out to me. It says, "For you are formed in my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." Now, if anybody knows this well, it's David. And actually, as far as illustrating this part of God's presence, his incomprehensible passion, David's life is, to me, is the perfect example. And it actually starts before he was king. A lot of us are familiar with the story of Saul was anointed as the first king of Israel, and then during his reign, David was anointed and he became king. But as we look at this, there's something we can see if we really start dissecting the story that God's telling us. And it starts in 1 Samuel 13, 8 through 14. And I'll quickly paraphrase this, but Saul is in Gilgal, and people are scattering from him, and he's supposed to be an anointed king. Samuel's supposed to be coming, and he's going to be offering a burnt offering to God to bless the rule of Saul, and people start scattering, and Saul gets scared. Rather than trusting in God, he jumps the gun and decides, well, I'll offer the offering myself. Samuel's not here, and I don't want everyone to disperse and then lose everything I've worked for, because for Saul it was everything he worked for, not everything that God is doing in his life. And when Samuel gets there, he sees what Saul has done, and the specific words he says is, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of your Lord God with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept the word the Lord commanded you." So that's where this starts, about having this revelation through David's life. And as we look, we jump ahead to 1 Samuel 16, which is when David is anointed as king. And I'll paraphrase this one as well. We all know the story halfway well, and if you don't, this is pretty much how it goes. Samuel comes to the house of Jesse. Jesse is David's father, and God has sent him there because he's going to find one of Jesse's sons, and he's going to anoint them to be the new king. Well, when he gets there, he looks at all the sons, and he goes, "That's not any of them." And they say, "Well, there's one more. He's the little kid out in the field, my son David." And Samuel has David brought there, and he sees David, and he knows right away, that's who God has brought me here to anoint. And then the last part of this is 2 Samuel 5:4, and it's a very short verse. It says, "David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. Now, this is the reason why I point these out is not so much the story behind them, although the story behind them plays a big deal, especially where it starts in 1 Samuel 13, but it's the dates and when these happen. See, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and that was in 1003 BC. He was anointed, and granted, all these are give or take a year, but they still end with the same point. And that is that he was anointed in 1024 BC. So that was 21 years before he became king. So David was anointed king at 9 years old. 9 years old, God told Samuel that David is the man after my own heart. He's going to be king. It's a big responsibility as a 9-year-old. I know for me, I have images of where the wild things are and not being a good king at all. And then we look at when Saul messed up, when Saul messed up, when God told Samuel to speak to Saul that he was no longer going to be king. And in fact, there's going to be a different person that's going to be ruler of all Israel. And I already know him, and he's a man after my own heart. That happened at 1041 BC. 17 years before David was anointed. But he was 9 years old when he was anointed. That means 8 years before David was even born, God had already saw his unformed. God had already knew that he was going to be a man after his own heart. David's frame wasn't hidden from him when he was being made in secret. 8 years before he was born, God knew that David would be a man after his own heart. That to me is not just incomprehensible, but when we talk about the passion about that. Before David was born, 8 years before David was born, and probably even before that, but when God reveals already that David is a man after his own heart, it's 8 years before he was born, God already knew David on that intimate of a level. Before you were born, God already knew you on an intimate level. And this is the relation that we have in our lives and the relation we have in David's life, but this is where it gets really just... Is God called David a man after his own heart, and he knew him on that intimate level, but he already knew every single one of his days before they were written, as if there was none of them yet. And not only did he see the good in David, but he also saw the lust in David. He saw the violence in David. Because we also see in David's story that he took another man's wife, and when he realized she was pregnant, tried to get away with it, but once she was pregnant, his solution was, well, that's not a problem. I'll try to have him sleep with her, and then, he'll think it's his kid. So now he's starting a deceiving role, and even when that doesn't work out, he's like, well, I guess my only solution is I'll kill him. Send him to the front lines. He'll die there. And yet he's a man after God's own heart. And the reality is we all have those faults in us. We all have those sins. We've all missed the mark just as David has. That God's passion for us doesn't change. To try to get it a little more clear, that incomprehensible is not able to be understood. And passion, a strong, extravagant fondness, enthusiasm, or desire. So what I'm saying here is that God's presence is an extravagant fondness. It's such a strong desire. And it's beyond anything we can understand. Because I'm sure we've all had those people in our lives. They might be a good person, and we might have some good memories with them, but if they did half of what David did to us in our lives, they wouldn't be that close to us anymore. This is where it gets incomprehensible, because God has seen the faults in your life even before you were born. He knew you on an intimate level, that he saw the good, he saw the things that he loved, and yet at the same time he saw where you're going to miss the mark. He saw where you were going to fall short of his holiness, and yet he said, doesn't matter to me. I still love you. Doesn't matter to me. I still want to be with you. It doesn't matter to me. You can go wherever you want to go, and you might try to escape me any way possible, but I'm still going to be there. Because my presence is incomprehensible passion. Then I came to this last part, and actually I found this ironic because when I started reading, I went, whoa, David really switched his tone, because he starts here, oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. How precious are your thoughts to me, O God, how vast the sum of them. If I were to count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, I am still with you. Slay the wicked, O God. It's almost like David walked away from this, came back 5 days later, and someone made him really angry or betrayed him. And actually, a lot of commentaries, that's actually what they speculate. But he completely switches emotions, words, and just the complete feel of this psalm, where he says, oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God, O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malice intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And see if there's any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And even those last two verses compared to those first four are kind of switching back. But I think it's because it's our own feelings, it's our own perceptions, the reason why these verses don't fit together. But when we come to God's presence, they actually fit together perfectly. Actually, the thing I found ironic, I should finish this, is I started rabbit trailing a little bit. But as I read through some of my commentaries, one of them actually said that verses 19 through 24, or at least 19 through 22, just stay away from. They don't quite fit. Don't preach from them. And and actually, when I looked online, I found it funny because there's a lot of people, they skip over the verses. Just a little hop, and if I count them, they are more than a sands. I wake and I'm still with you. So search me, O God, and know my heart, and try me and know my thoughts. And it's our own perception that we skip over these, because we all know that God is a God of love. And not to sound like a broken record, because I know I've said this in at least 2 different sermons, but above everything, God is a God of holiness. God is a God of love, but God is a God of holiness. And so the one thing we don't like putting together is that God loves and God hates at the same time. None of us likes putting those 2 words together, but we can see that when David is talking and revealing his relationship between him and God, he says, do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. Now, the thing that we do get mixed up here is that, and what we do is when we get on this idea that God does hate certain things, we get on the idea that God hates people. In reality, God doesn't hate people. He hates the unholiness. He hates the sin. He hates the things that make us miss the mark. So when we look at this, and David is saying to allow him to hate, allow him to loathe, allow him to hate with complete hatred the things that God hates. The next part is to me actually the scariest part, not this first part, but the second part, because to me the reason why a lot of us don't like putting the fact that God hates sin, we don't like saying that, because a lot of us, oh, God doesn't like sin. He doesn't want it to be near us, because when we actually go, God hates sin. He doesn't want sin in his life, in our life. He doesn't want us to be pulled away from him, because he loves us. He wants us to be with him, and he's holy. He can't be around unholiness. And the reason why we don't like to say God hates the things in our lives that pull us away from him is because when we come to that reality, now we actually have to start being transformed. And it's easier for us to hold on to those things in our lives when, oh, God just doesn't like it. But when we have that thing in our hand and we look at it and go, God hates this, now there's a little bit more of an emotion. There's a little bit more of a drive to actually let it go. And in reality, a lot of us are like this when it comes to it. And that, to me, is why the next 2 verses are actually the scariest, because what David actually does is he opens his hands. He says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there's any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Which in reality is a lot of times the hardest thing for us to do. We normally don't have a problem coming up to someone and saying, look at this. God hates that. Get rid of it. Do you really think God wants you to have that in your life? Get rid of it. We have no problem doing that to someone, but a lot of times we have a problem actually coming to ourselves and going, the exact same thing is in my hands. to continue in those definitions, when I looked up steadfast, the definition was resolutely or dutifully firm and unwavering. And presence, a state or fact of existing, occurring, or being present in a place or thing. Then we put those together is that God is an existence in our life that is resolutely, that is dutifully unwavering. We change in our lives, we grow, we are mature, we're immature, we have our faults, we have our successes, we have our ups and downs. But God is unwavering. God doesn't change. God is who he is since the beginning of the time, and God is who he is today, and God is who he is until the end of time. He's unwavering. And when I started putting these together, the thing that was revealed to me was the need to know this, and also too the need for balance in this, because we can't just focus on God as a steadfast presence. He's unwavering, because then we get this kind of what Dr. Walls was talking about the last few weeks, the truth and the grace, and that is we start hammering the truth, and we can't have the persistent grace, the incomprehensible passion outweigh the protective discernment and steadfast presence to a point that, well, it's okay at whatever I do because God's grace is persistent and his passion's incomprehensible, so it doesn't matter what I do. There has to be a balance of knowing that God is in our lives to protect us, that God is steadfast, he's unwavering in who he is, and yet, even when I fall short, his grace is persistent, even when I do something that is horrid enough to merit death by some laws of sleeping with another man's wife and killing her husband, as David did. His passion is still incomprehensible. There still has to be those balance, but they still have to be known. We still have to have that knowledge in our life, because, and the reality is that life is messy. The reality is life is inconsistent, but God is the opposite, and it is spoken in his word so many times. And if there's any part of scripture that screams about God and his presence, it's Psalms 139. And what I'm not saying is to go into it further. I'm not saying that by knowing this, everything's going to be sunshine and rainbows. There's no verse in Scripture that says, accept Christ, know who God is, and everything's going to be sweet and dandy. However, Christ does say that when he was teaching the disciples and teaching people, that he was teaching them of God's presence, so that way, when they were in trouble, not if, but when they were in troubles, when they were in turmoils, they could have peace in him. You see, no matter what the situation is, God is going to be there, whether we like it or not. Whether we deserve it or not, whether we've earned it or not. He'll still be a protective discernment. He'll still be a persistent grace. He will still be an incomprehensible passion. He will still be a steadfast presence in our life. And when we learn that, it does two things for us. First, it gives us that hope, that rescue in our lives for those moments where everything seems like the lights are turned off, when everything seems confusing and everything seems lost. The second, it allows us to be transformed. It allows us to start letting go of the things in our life that are holding us back from God. It allows us to have a better understanding of God's presence in our lives. It allows us to understand that God is a here, now God. Because the reality is we might have parents that have disappointed us or not been there before us. We might have friends that have disappointed us, not been there for us. We might have brothers or sisters or children, people in our lives that weren't there for us in a time of need or when we were hoping that they were going to be here. But the one being in our lives that is always there is God. And again, whether we like it or not, it's God. See, God is the God who is there laying on the floor with us when we're learning how to crawl. God is the God who is there with us jumping in the crib when we need someone to hold. God is the God who is there for every single dance rehearsal, every single dance recital in our lives. God is the God who is there for every practice and every single ball game. Our God is the God who is there through graduations, who's there through every big change in our lives, marriages, children. Our God is the God who's there through our most painful moments, through our most joyful moments. Our God is the God who is there when we feel like we just want to rip something off the wall and smash something because we've had such a bad day. And our God is the God who is there laughing with us almost in tears because today has been just so wonderful. Our God is there in the sun. He's there in the rain. Our God is there through no matter what point of life we're going through, even when we try to ride on the wings of the morning to the far sides of the sea or go to the deepest of depths or try to hide in darkness. Our God is God. He was there, he is here, and he's always going to be here because our God is a here, now God. And many of us realize that. A lot of us understand that about God, but a lot of us don't bring that into a full comprehension. And that is one thing we do in worship, which is a great thing, is we ask God's presence, right, Greg? We welcome God into this place. Now, here's the thing, the part that we don't get is God's actually already here. In reality, when we say, God, let your presence be here, let your presence overtake us, that's all of a sudden when we start turning the point. What we're really doing is we're preparing ourselves for God's presence. We're preparing our own hearts. We're preparing our own souls for God's presence to allow him to speak into us and to move in us. And even when we aren't prepared, guess what? God still speaks to us and he still moves in us. Because that's who our God is. He's a here now God. As I wrap up, the worship team is going to come up. I've asked Greg to, if him and the worship team could introduce a new song today, because Hillsong recently released a new CD called Empire, and I will fully admit I stole the title of this sermon from their song. But while I was about halfway through this sermon, my wife had told me that, hey, I got Hillsong's new CD, and I said, great, and I went ahead and I put it on and started listening to it, and then this song came on, and I realized as I was going through my readings and as God was revealing things to me, whether the artists of Hillsong meant to do this or not, they basically poured Psalms 139 out in a song. In the first part of I call it the pre-chorus and the chorus, and I'm sure that my terminology is off, but the part right before the chorus just screams the first three parts, and that is, your ways are higher. Your thoughts are wilder. Love came like madness, poured out, and blood washed romance. It makes no sense, but this is grace. And I know you're with me in this place. And when I first heard those words, it kind of made me stop in my tracks. I realized basically what they had said was, God, you're protected discernment. God, you're this persistent grace. God, you're this incomprehensible passion. Even when it doesn't make sense, you're there. And even though I had said a lot of people like skipping over those last 6 verses, but they are so important, I realized that they had it perfect in their lyrics as the chorus. And it's here now. All I know is I know that you are here now. Still my heart, let your voice be all I hear. And then almost like a mirror image to the way that David ends his psalm of search me, O God, and know my heart. They end the chorus with this: Spirit, breathe like the wind, come have your way. And in reality, that's a hard thing to understand. That's a hard thing to actually say to God. God, like the wind, come have your way in my life. A lot of us like to have our feet planted firmly on the ground and God, I'll call you when I need you. That's not how God works. And they end it with, because I know you're in this place. Whether I'm ready for it, whether I like it, God, you're here. And God's not going anywhere. Because our God is a here, now God.